Hi, Misha here, and in my ongoing coverage of Japanese warships, let's return to aircraft carriers and look at the two in the Shokaku class, Shokaku herself, and Zuikaku. These were really the most advanced aircraft carriers not only in the Imperial Japanese Navy when they were launched, but arguably in the whole world. And they would be in every major battle except Midway, much to their fortune, in World War II, at least up until 1944. And these were the first Japanese carriers to be built after Japan abrogated the various treaties. So I have a model here from Eagle Moss, one 1100 scale diecast of Shokaku. I don't have Zuikaku because they didn't really release them here in America in large numbers, and well, you get what you get. But we'll talk about both. And just kind of talk about nearly the most advanced Japanese carrier of the war as well. With that, let's just get into it. Before Shokaku, this vessel, Hiryu, was the most advanced and modern carrier in the Japanese Navy, and she was very fast and had a respectable aircraft capacity, but she was still designed and primarily built under the treaty system, meaning she was built with a tonnage limit. However, in 1937, the Imperial Navy essentially had a blank check to develop new carriers. They had an increased budget, and they didn't have to worry about treaties. So what did they want? Well, they wanted kind of a carrier that could do everything. It needed to have the speed of Hiryu, but it needed to have the aircraft carrying potential of Akagi and Kaga, and it needed to have better range armor protection than anything that had come earlier. So they started with the Hiryu plans, but improved them in everywhere they could think of. So in 1937 they worked on this design. It was to be over 32,000 tons, about 845 feet long, and would have a more advanced modern propulsion system, which would eventually get it up to 34.5 knots in trials. And they would use some of the hydrodynamic studies they had conducted when creating Yamato to make her rudder and hull and bow and stuff. So they really did try to go advanced. Originally they wanted her to have a total of 96 aircraft, including spares. In actuality, because of the growing size of naval aircraft at the time, this would end up being 72 plus 12 spares, so pretty close. And she would be the first carrier to have a torpedo belt with armor. And of course, anti-aircraft defenses. Her flight deck was 795 feet long by 95 feet wide. 3 elevators serviced 2 hangar decks. The lower one was 636 feet long and was only suitable for fighters. The upper one was 656 feet long and could manage torpedo and dive bombers. She was planned to have 2 catapults, but these were never completed, never installed. Interestingly, originally the island was to be on the port side like Kiryu, but they moved it during construction to the starboard side in more of a forward location, as this was thought to be more effective and useful. So they would first lay down Shokaku, and then soon after her sister Zuikaku. Both would be launched in 1939, and Shokaku would be commissioned in August of 1941, with Zuikaku commissioned about 6 weeks later in September. So they both were in service prior to Pearl Harbor, if just barely. As soon as they were commissioned, they were immediately assigned to the 5th Carrier Division and began training for the Pearl Harbor attack. And they were there on December 7. Because both ships were new with new crews, they were given what were considered to be the easier targets, the airfields around Pearl Harbor, and each had 27 D3As, 27 B5Ns, and 18 Zeros, A6Ms. And they would be quite successful, although Shokaku would lose 1 plane during the attack. Both, of course, would escape with the other 4 carriers. And next, both Zuikaku and Shokaku would operate with Kaga and Akagi, January of 1942. And they would attack Australian forces at Rabaul. And this operation was to kind of secure Japan's southern flank after her recent gains in the Pacific. After this successful operation, they would return to the Japanese port at Truk for resupply and for their next assignment. After a successful debut and 2 successful operations, Shokaku and Zuikaku would be retained in home waters throughout February and into March because Japan wasn't sure what the Allies might do next, and so they wanted them there in case there was a retaliation. Then they began training up for what we know as the Indian Ocean raids, and their air group was slightly altered. They upped their number of A6Ms to 21 each, and therefore downed their B5Ns and D3As to 21 each. Next, they would commit to the so-called Easter Sunday raid on Colombo on April 5th, 1942. And on April 8th, both carriers would play a major part in sinking the British carrier HMS Hermes and her Australian escort Vampire, because they were pretty much the first carriers to get planes over them and on scene. Following this, they would take part, along with Shoho, in the Battle of the Coral Sea between May 6th and 8th. This obviously didn't start well for the Japanese because they lost Shoho, but then it was Shokaku and Zuikaku versus USS Lexington and USS Yorktown. Both launched bombers at each other, and Shokaku was hit 3 times by bombs, putting her flight deck out of action. However, she was able to use her modern rudder and maneuverability and speed to evade torpedoes. Not to mention American torpedoes at this time were not stellar. So no killing blow was really done. She was just out of action a little bit, but not in danger of sinking. Zuikaku, and what would become a running theme, was actually spared any damage because she was hidden by clouds, a little bit of a rain squall. However, America would take some pretty big losses. Yorktown would be damaged by a very good bomb hit, meaning she had to put in for emergency repairs at Pearl Harbor, meaning that when she was used a month later at Midway, she still wasn't at full capacity, although full credit to her sailors. They did an amazing job, and the repair teams. But Lexington was hit multiple times, which ultimately led to her having to be scuttled because of a fuel leak, a vapor leak, and that credit has to be given to the planes of Shokaku and Zuikaku. So with that, the two ships would head back to Japan to repair Shokaku's damage, and on the way, she was actually nearly lost because of hitting bad weather, a nearly hurricane-force storm. Her battle damage plus some other factors meant she almost went under, but the crew were able to keep her upright, and she made it back to Japan, and she was put in for full repair, and she was back in action in August of 1942. And it's worth pointing out that in September, Shokaku would be the first Japanese aircraft carrier to be fitted with an early warning radar set. Something that many carriers wouldn't have because they were lost at Midway. And speaking of, because Japan's other fleet carriers were lost at Midway, that meant that the two sister ships of the Shokaku class were really Japan's biggest asset in the Pacific now, at least in terms of aircraft carriers. But also keep in mind, America's strength is pretty reduced at this time, having lost Lexington and Yorktown. For a time, they really just had Enterprise. So while we look back at Midway today, feeling it was the decisive battle, which it was, in August and September of 42, things weren't as clear-cut. It still seemed a bit of a nail-biter, at least to some. Just as Shokaku was finishing up her repairs, the Allies surprised the Japanese by the landings on Guadalcanal. So the two sisters, along with Ryujo, the light carrier, which I've done a video on, were assigned to go. And they were escorting transports. Ryujo was ordered ahead, and the two Shokaku were ordered to hold back. This meant that the Enterprise and Saratoga's planes would go after Ryujo and quite quickly sink her. But this was good for the Shokakus because this meant that they only had a small group they could send after them. They would have a few minor skirmishes here or there. Both sides would take minor losses, including Enterprise being hit by some bombs. But really, at the battle of what would become known as the Battle of the Eastern Solomons, both sides would disengage before much else would happen. But the Japanese would serve that loss. After this, both carriers would head back home. And then in October, a new light carrier would be assigned to operate with them, Zuiho. And then they would be sent to support operations. This would become the Battle of the Santa Cruz Islands. Between the 24th and the 26th, there'd be some pretty heavy fighting. Shokaku again would be damaged by some bomb hits, but Zuikaku would again avoid damage thanks to weather. Enterprise would again take a few hits, but the big loser would be Hornet, who, while her planes did some damage to the Japanese vessels there, she would end up being damaged heavily and ultimately lost. Of course, Japan would not be successful here, but both ships of the class would withdraw. Again, Shokaku damaged, but still afloat. So on November 2nd, they were ordered back to Truk for repairs. More importantly than the damage to Shokaku, though, they had taken heavy losses to their air group, losing around 99 planes, and probably more important than the hardware itself were skilled veteran pilots were lost. One thing that's kind of different about the Shokaku model from Eagle Moss versus most others, the others usually come with the aircraft pre-glued on the deck. And this is one of the few that doesn't. They come in 2 small little bags. So it's kind of interesting trying to glue them on. Just thought I'd mention that. Anyway, Shokaku was in for repairs. So really for the first time, her sister, along with Zuikaku, would rally out January 1943 to support the withdrawal from the Guadalcanal, essentially retreat of the Japanese attempt to retake it, returning home. And then in March, Shokaku was up and running again. And not a lot would happen in 1943 for the Japanese Navy. They would rally out a few times looking for the American fleet, not finding a lot of success. In February of 1944, they would be assigned, they would be stationed at Singapore for a brief time. It's also worth pointing out that at the end of 1943, Shokaku and Zuikaku's air group was detached to land operations and would suffer again heavy losses, meaning even more other skilled veteran pilots would be lost. Anyway, then in May 1944, again with their air groups intact, although with lots of fresh faces, they would be assigned to the Philippines, which leads us to the Battle of the Philippine Sea. As I'm sure most of you know, by June of 1944, the war had definitively turned against the Japanese Navy, and the Battle of the Philippine Sea, especially with what we know as the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, definitively went in America's favor, the Allies' favor, and Shokaku would be lost. On June 18, she would first be hit by a torpedo, followed by 2 to 3 others. This would lead to one of her own bombs detonating, and this would lead to 3 or 4 major explosions, which essentially gutted the ship, and very quickly she would go under. Of her crew of over 1,700, including the air group, only about 570 would be rescued. The rest would be lost. So well over 1,000 souls were lost. And again, it just wasn't a good battle for the Japanese. The next day, her sister, who up to this point had been very fortunate in war, finally was hit by a bomb while trying to rally and have an orderly retreat. And that afternoon, Zuikaku was hit. It did start a fire on her on her flight deck, but they were able to put her under control. And while she was not quite at full speed, she was able to withdraw, really becoming Japan's last surviving fleet carrier. And again, more importantly, all of the air groups on the various ships there had again been mauled. In fact, only 102 airplanes survived amongst all the ships that made it out of the Battle of the Philippine Sea. So it basically broke the back of the Imperial Japanese Navy's air service. After this time, it was all over. So even though Zuikaku was the fleet carrier left, they really didn't have any planes or pilots to use her with anyway. And thus we come to the Battle of Leyte Gulf. At Leyte Gulf, the northern force was a decoy force, and Zuikaku had the honor of being the flagship of it. She probably had the most aircraft as well. She had 28 of the newer A6 M5 Zeros, 16 of the older A6 M2s. She had 7 of the D4Y reconnaissance aircraft, pretty new, and 15 or so of the new B6N bomber. So this was about as good as it get, but even this was for decoy. And she started flying her planes on the 24th to try to attract attention and get the Americans to go for the bait, thus hopefully leaving their transports and whatnot vulnerable to the Japanese battleships. This didn't work out as planned. So on the 25th, the Americans sent fighters against Zuikaku and her ships. And in the very first wave that morning, she was hit by 1 torpedo and 3 bombs that started fires and pretty much had her in bad shape. Therefore, the second wave just kind of ignored her. And then the third wave from the American carriers finished her off with 6 torpedoes and 4 more bomb hits. So she did take a beating. But by this point, she's set ablaze and, not long for this world. In the end, when the order to abandon ship was given, the Navy was able to rescue a little under 900 of her crew, so about half of her crew. So not as big of a massacre as her sister, but still. And so, thus ended the story of the last Japanese fleet carrier, and really the last Japanese carrier until the 21st century. But not the last one in service. There would be one more who would have a career of about a day. Okay, maybe not that short, but close. But that's a story for the next time. As always, I appreciate you tuning in. If you could, like, share, and subscribe. This is Misha. Catch you very soon. Next time.